The wind, a relentless harpy, scoured the skeletal branches of the pines, carrying with it the bitter scent of ice and impending snow. Alara huddled deeper into the threadbare shawl, its wool offering little comfort against the gnawing cold that seeped into her bones. 2 months it had been since the wagons had fallen silent, since the fever had claimed her last kin, leaving her a solitary, fragile shadow in a land that cared nothing for human grief. Her small, desperate cache of dried venison was dwindling to dust, and the thought of another day's hunger clawed at her empty stomach with talons sharper than any wolf's. She had walked for days, a phantom drifting across the vast, indifferent landscape, drawn by a faint rumor, a whisper of a solitary cabin nestled deep in these unforgiving mountains. A man, they said, a hermit, who had lived alone for 20 years, a ghost amongst the living, his existence barely acknowledged by the few scattered settlements. Fear was a constant companion, but desperation, a fiercer master, pushed her onward. The sun, a pale, indifferent coin, dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges, a spectacle too grand for her weary eyes. Each step was a prayer, each breath a struggle against the icy air that burned her lungs. Then, through the swirling dust and the first hesitant flakes of snow, a wisp of smoke. A column, thin but steady, rising against the darkening sky. Hope, a fragile, dangerous ember, flickered within her. It was a crude cabin, built of logs scarred by time and weather, nestled low against a granite outcrop like a forgotten limb of the mountain itself. No window offered a glimpse within, only a heavy door, its timber dark and unyielding. She hesitated, the last vestige of her dignity warring with the raw instinct for survival. What kind of man lived like this? What would he do to a trespasser, a lone woman on the edge of collapse? Before she could decide, before she could even knock, a low rumble, distinct from the wind, vibrated through the earth. 3 figures emerged from the gloom of the approaching twilight, their forms merging with the deepening shadows. Apache. Her breath hitched, a gasp caught in her throat. She instinctively pressed herself against the cold, rough bark of a pine, camouflaged by the deepening twilight and the falling snow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They were tall, silent, their faces obscured by the coming night, but their bearing was unmistakable. They moved with a predatory grace, their movements fluid, purposeful. Not raiders, not hunters. They carried no weapons openly. They approached the cabin door, not with aggression, but with a strange, almost reverent stillness. Then, in unison, without a sound, all 3 knelt before the silent timber, their heads bowed, their faces turned to the ground. The sight was unsettling, beyond anything she had ever witnessed. It was not a siege, but a supplication, a profound, solemn request made of the man who had lived alone for 20 years. Alara could only watch, a terrified, invisible observer, as the cabin door, after a long, agonizing moment, slowly, almost reluctantly, creaked open. A man stood framed in the opening, a silhouette against the faint glow of an interior fire. He was broad-shouldered, his frame solid despite an apparent age etched into his posture. His hair, long and gray, was pulled back, and his face, even from a distance, seemed carved from the same stone as the mountain itself, weathered, unyielding, but with eyes that held an ancient, unsettling wisdom. He said nothing, simply stood there, observing the 3 kneeling warriors with an unwavering gaze. The air thickened with unspoken meaning, with a history Alara could not fathom. The snow began to fall in earnest now, large, silent flakes swirling around the figures, dusting their shoulders, settling on the bowed heads of the warriors. A full minute passed in absolute silence, broken only by the wind's mournful song. The man, the hermit, finally moved. His gaze, slow and deliberate, swept over each kneeling warrior, assessing, weighing. Alara, hidden, felt an inexplicable tension build, as if the fate of the entire mountain hung on his silent judgment. He paused on the warrior kneeling in the middle, his form slightly slumped, a faint sheen of sweat visible on his brow despite the cold. There was a wound, Alara realized, a dark, spreading stain on the man's buckskin tunic, barely visible in the fading light. A decision, unhurried yet firm, seemed to settle in the old man's eyes. He extended a hand, not to beckon, but to indicate. A single, decisive gesture. He chose one of them, the middle one, the wounded one. The other two warriors, without a word, rose as one, bowed their heads once more, and then melted back into the deepening gloom, swallowed by the falling snow and the vast, indifferent wilderness from which they had come. The chosen warrior, with a visible effort, pushed himself to his feet. The old man stepped aside, opening the door wider. The warrior stumbled inside, and the heavy door closed with a soft thud, leaving Alara alone once more, shivering in the gathering darkness, the mystery of what she had witnessed now her only companion. Fear still gnawed at her, but a new, potent curiosity had taken root. What was this place? What kind of man was this, who commanded such strange deference from Apache warriors? The hunger, the cold, they still pressed in, but now, a flicker of something else. The realization that this isolated cabin, with its silent, enigmatic inhabitant, was her only chance. She waited until the last light had faded, until the snow had become a thick, muffling blanket. Then, gathering her remaining courage, she stumbled towards the door, driven by an instinct far older and more powerful than any fear. She lifted a trembling hand, her knuckles brushing against the rough timber, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the vast silence of the mountain, a tiny, fragile plea in an immense, unforgiving world. The door remained closed. She knocked again, a little louder, a desperate, hoarse whisper escaping her lips. Still nothing. Despair threatened to engulf her once more, but then, a faint click. The door slowly opened a crack. Silas peered out, his eyes, the color of deep earth, inscrutable in the dim light. He saw her, a wisp of a woman, framed by the falling snow, her face gaunt, her eyes wide with a desperate, animal fear. He had heard her approach, every crunch of snow beneath her worn boots, every ragged breath. He had known she was there, observing. His gaze, devoid of judgment, swept over her emaciated frame, her tattered clothes, the raw, chapped skin on her hands. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand an explanation. He simply stepped back, a silent invitation, and left the door ajar. Alara hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then stumbled across the threshold, into the warmth, into the faint scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, into a sanctuary as strange and unsettling as the wilderness she had just left. Inside, the single room was Spartan yet orderly. A rough-hewn table, 2 stools, a stone fireplace where logs crackled softly, casting dancing shadows. On the floor, near the hearth, the Apache warrior lay on a bearskin rug, still, but for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His wound, a clean, deep gash across his side, was roughly bandaged, the fabric already stained dark. Silas knelt beside him, his large, calloused hands methodically preparing a poultice from a small leather pouch. Alara watched, mesmerized, her fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this quiet, purposeful act. The warrior's face, now visible in the firelight, was young, stoic, etched with pain but not surrender. Silas glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. "Water," he rasped, his voice gravelly and used. He gestured with his chin to a bucket by the door. Alara, her hands still shaking, moved to obey, filling a wooden cup. She offered it to Silas, who took it without a word, then knelt to press it to the warrior's lips. It was a simple act, devoid of sentiment, yet imbued with a profound, unspoken care. Alara watched the warrior, Kale, as she would later learn, stir, his eyes flickering open, dark and intense. He looked at Silas, a silent understanding passing between them. Then his gaze shifted to Alara, a flicker of surprise in his eyes before they closed again. The first days were a silent negotiation. Alara, still raw from her ordeal, clung to the periphery, a frightened sparrow in a hawk's nest. Silas, the hermit of 20 years, moved with deliberate slowness, his actions predictable, his silence absolute. He offered her food, a thin stew, a piece of hardtack without comment, and she ate, ravenous, her dignity a luxury she could no longer afford. She observed him, learning his routines. He was a man of the earth, his hands knowing the feel of bark, the weight of a trap, the delicate balance of a medicinal herb. Kale, the Apache warrior, began to mend, slowly at first, then with the resilience of youth. He spoke even less than Silas, his movements economical, his eyes constantly watchful. He watched Alara, too, a quiet assessment in his gaze that made her skin prickle. There was no explanation offered for Kale's presence, nor for the ritual of the kneeling warriors. It was simply accepted, a given in this strange, isolated existence. Alara learned not to ask. The mountain, Silas, and Kale held their secrets closely. As the days bled into weeks, a fragile rhythm began to emerge. Alara, driven by a desperate need to contribute, began to help. She fetched water, split kindling, learned to mend torn clothes with clumsy stitches. Silas would watch her, his gaze unreadable, but never interfering, never criticizing. Kale, when strong enough, would venture out, returning with small game or bundles of dried herbs, his presence a silent, watchful shadow. One afternoon, Silas returned from setting traps, his brow furrowed, a faint tension in his usually placid demeanor. He sat at the table, taking his pipe from a pouch, but did not light it. Kale, who had been honing an arrow, paused, his attention fixed on Silas. "They are closer," Silas rumbled, his voice rough. Alara stiffened. She knew what he meant. The men who had orphaned her, the outlaws who had ravaged her settlement, were trackers, relentless in their pursuit of any survivor, any last shred of wealth. She had fled them for weeks, always looking over her shoulder. Now, it seemed, they had found her trail, or perhaps, were simply drawn to the cabin's remote solitude. A chance encounter for men of their ilk. Kale's hand instinctively went to the bough beside him. His gaze met Alara's, and for the first time, she saw not suspicion, but a shared understanding, a quiet resolve. The fragile sanctuary was threatened, and with it, their tenuous, unspoken alliance. The bond, forged in silence and necessity, was about to be tested by fire. The snow had returned with a vengeance, muffling the world in a vast, oppressive silence. But the silence inside the cabin was taut, stretched thin by the impending threat. Silas moved with a quiet intensity, boarding up the small, shuttered openings, checking his old rifle. Kale, fully recovered now, was a coiled spring of readiness, his arrows tipped with obsidian, his movements fluid and deadly. Alara, too, felt a shift within her. The despair that had clung to her like a shroud was receding, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She was no longer just a victim. This cabin, these men, had become a fragile anchor in a chaotic world, and she would defend it. She would defend them. They came at dawn, their approach heralded by the distant, sharp crack of a dry branch, then the muffled crunch of their boots on the packed snow. 3 of them, just like the Apache, but these men reeked of greed and cruelty. Silas took position at a reinforced opening, his rifle barrel resting on a thick log. Kale stood by the door, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked, his eyes fixed on the timber. Alara, clutching a heavy iron poker, positioned herself near the hearth, her heart pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. She was terrified, but the terror was intertwined with a strange, fierce defiance. "Open up, old man," a gruff voice bellowed from outside. "We know you got something worth talking, and we seen a woman's tracks, too. Don't hide what's ours." Silas remained silent, his gaze unwavering. A shot rang out, splintering a piece of wood near the opening. Kale's arrow hissed through the air, a whisper of death, followed by a grunt of pain from outside. A moment of shocked silence, then a volley of shouts and angry curses. The attack began in earnest. The cabin became a crucible, sounds of splintering wood, the thud of bodies, the sharp reports of firearms, all echoing in the confined space. Silas fired with grim precision, each shot deliberate, aimed. Cale was a blur of motion, his bow a silent, deadly extension of his will. Alara, despite her terror, found herself moving with an instinct she hadn't known she possessed. When one of the bandits managed to force open a shutter, his face a snarling mask of triumph, she didn't hesitate. The heavy iron poker swung with all her strength, connecting with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled, a surprised groan escaping him. She saw the shock in Silas's eyes, a flicker of something akin to approval. She saw the brief, sharp nod from Cale, a silent acknowledgement. This was no longer just his fight or Silas's. It was hers too. The skirmish was brutal, swift. 2 of the bandits fell, one to Silas's rifle, the other to Cale's arrow. The third, seeing his comrades falter, hesitated, then turned and fled back into the snow-laden woods, a broken figure swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Silence descended once more, heavy and profound, broken only by the ragged breaths of the 3 inside the cabin. Alara stood, trembling, the poker still clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. Her limbs ached, her chest heaved, but an unfamiliar surge of power coursed through her veins. She had not merely survived. She had fought. Silas leaned his rifle against the wall, his face etched with weariness, but his eyes held a quiet satisfaction. Cale, his bow lowered, approached her, his gaze steady. He reached out not to touch but to offer. In his hand was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, simple yet beautiful. For the brave heart, he rumbled, his voice low, his first words directed solely at her. It was a gesture of respect, a silent acknowledgement of her transformation. In the days that followed, the snow melted, revealing the scarred earth, but inside the cabin, something new had blossomed. The unspoken understanding between Silas, Cale, and Alara had solidified into an unyielding bond. The cabin, once a hermitage, then a desperate refuge, was now a home, forged in shared hardship and the fierce fire of survival. Silas, the man who had lived alone for 20 years, no longer carried the solitary burden of his existence. His choice, made that fateful day before the kneeling warriors, had brought not just Cale, but Alara into his world, weaving their fates irrevocably together. He had chosen not merely a wounded warrior, but a path towards an unexpected family, a testament to the quiet, profound connections forged in the crucible of adversity. Alara, watching Silas and Cale working together, preparing for the coming spring, knew she was irrevocably changed. The gaunt, despairing woman who had stumbled through the snow was gone, replaced by someone resilient, someone who knew the taste of fear and the exhilaration of fighting back. The vast, empty landscape no longer felt so daunting. She had found her place, not in the bustling towns or the settled valleys, but in this quiet, hard-won corner of the world, with these 2 silent, powerful men. It was a partnership of 3 disparate souls, bound by respect, by need, by the shared breath of life. And in their quiet, understated way, they were family. The journey had been arduous, marked by loss and solitude. But here, in the heart of the mountains, amidst the echoes of violence and the promise of renewal, Alara had found not just survival, but dignity, strength, and a quiet, enduring hope.